Hi, guys. Today we will start with the story The Most Disgusting Professions in the Middle Ages. A city that smells of death mourning. In the medieval city begins with fog, mingled with smoke and stench. Along the cobbled streets flows murky water, mixed with waste. People throw slop directly from their windows. The excess dampness and filth make the air thick and heavy. At the center of this reality are people no one notices, or no one wants to notice. The street cleaners appear first. They are the earliest to rise, their footsteps echoing through empty alleys, dressed in simple, soiled garments, often with leather aprons. On their shoulders, baskets in their hands, wooden shovels, hooks, and buckets. Their task is to collect what the night has left behind: excrement, scraps, carcasses. At a crossroads lies a dead dog. A man glances around, then grabs it by the hind legs and drags the body toward his cart. He throws it on top without care. The cart already holds rat corpses, chicken heads, and rotting vegetables. It rolls toward the city dump, a pit beyond the walls, where piles of garbage smolder and smoke. Work continues into the daylight. Through the streets move cesspit men, emptying waste from privies. They lift wooden covers that lead to the foul depths below. One climbs down, waist deep in human waste. He works slowly, scooping with a bucket and transferring it to a barrel. His expression is calm. He's used to it. When the barrel is full, he signals his partner. Horses pull the heavy cart away, leaving a greasy trail over the stones. These people live on the outskirts. Their houses are wooden and unremarkable. In the evening, returning home, they greet no one, and no one greets them. People avoid them. They are considered unclean, physically and morally. Yet without them, the city would drown in its own stench. Blood and slaughter. Away from the residential quarters, closer to the city walls, stands the slaughterhouse. The air here is heavier, saturated with blood, the steam of hot carcasses, and the stench of entrails. Livestock is driven here from all over the region. The morning begins with lowing, squeals, and blunt impacts. Animals are forced down a narrow corridor. Some stumble, others resist, but the workers push them forward. Everything happens quickly, a blow, and the body collapses. Blood gushes into wooden channels, flowing down into a trench, then collected into barrels. The slaughterhouse workers stand ankle-deep in blood. Their arms are coated in fat, sweat, and guts up to the elbows. Around their waists, leather aprons darkened by years of use. One after another, they lift carcasses, slit open bellies, remove entrails, and toss them into vats. The smell is sharp, a mix of blood, fur, dung, and rot. The animals don't always die instantly. Some twitch and make dying sounds. The workers avoid eye contact, with the animals or with each other. The fatigue on their faces doesn't lift, even during breaks. In short pauses, they sit in corners, directly on the ground, wiping their hands on their aprons and silently chewing on bread. Nearby stands the fat rendering hut. Large cauldrons boil down scraps, bones, cartilage, leftover meat. All of it is reduced to fat for candles, soap, street lighting. A worker stirs the viscous mixture with a long pole. The steam clouds his eyes, the stench turns the stomach, but he does not flinch. He's used to it. They know the city needs meat, fat, bones, but no one calls them by name on the street. People turn away. They are feared and despised, as if the blood they touch passes its guilt onto them. The men beneath the lids. Behind the city markets and shop fronts lies another system, unseen but essential. Cesspits, drainage ditches, and latrines. Their condition directly affects the city's health. The job of maintaining them is among the dirtiest and most despised gong farmers or night soil workers come out deep into the night. Their time begins when the city sleeps. They pull heavy carts behind them, loaded with thick, tar-coated barrels. The horses move slowly, as if aware of the foul load they carry. The work begins with lifting lids, simple planks covering holes in the ground. Beneath them lie cesspits filled with human waste, accumulated over weeks. One man puts on a leather hood and climbs down a ladder. It's dark and slick. He stands knee-deep in filth. Using a bucket, he scoops the mass and sends it up with a rope. His partner pours it into the barrel. When it's full, they seal it tightly and move on, out of the city. Along the way, the stench seeps through the streets into houses. People draw their shutters, cover their noses, but no one complains. They know, if these men don't come out at night, the city will drown in stench by morning. Often gong farmers work at monasteries, palaces, and inns, where waste accumulates in volume. Some are paid regularly, in copper coins or in food, but they earn no respect anywhere. At times, they must clear blockages, using long wooden poles or iron hooks. They risk suffocation in tight spaces, falling into pits or contracting disease. They take no part in city life. They are barred from churches, celebrations, even casual gatherings. Their children are isolated, and yet every night they return, the stench and darkness becoming their world. Butchers and tanners. On the outskirts of medieval towns closer to rivers and marshes lay the tanners' workshops. These areas were considered cursed. The stench was so strong that even the wind seemed to turn away. The tanners' work began with the butchers. Their task was to strip the hides from dead animals. Horses, sheep, cows, all became sources of raw material. The hide was removed by hand, using knives sharp as razors. Blood flowed down wooden planks, gathering in grooves. The stripped hides were carried to the tanning workshops, where they awaited long processing. The first stage was maceration, soaking hides in vats, filled with water, urine, or feces. Yes, human urine was used as an active reagent. It helped break down remaining flesh and fat. Workers stood barefoot by the vats, the foul liquid splashing on their legs and hands. Next came cleaning. The hides were laid on wooden tables and scraped with blunt knives. Remnants of flesh, vessels, and hair were all removed by hand. The smell was acrid, saturated with ammonia, rot, and dampness. After drying and stretching, the hides were rubbed with bark, fat, and dog dung. All of this was applied with bare hands, sometimes in the heat of the sun. Tanners lived close to their workshops. Their houses were simple, often with separate sheds for hide storage. People pointed fingers at them in the market and kept their distance. It was believed they touched the dead and were therefore unclean in soul. But without them, there would be no boots, belts, gloves, sheaths, or books. Their labor surrounded everyone, but people tried not to notice them. Grave diggers and keepers of death. Deep within the medieval city, in cemeteries and near churches, worked the grave diggers, those who dealt directly with death. Their profession involved not only digging graves, but also maintaining order among the dead. In the evening, when darkness fell, gravediggers carried the bodies of the deceased from homes or hospitals. Sometimes these were victims of epidemics, their skin covered with spots, their bodies emitting the foul odor of decay. The workers wore rough leather gloves and long coats to protect themselves from contact. They dug graves by hand with shovels and pickaxes. The earth was heavy and damp, clods rolling back into the hole. Often, they had to work quickly to prepare a place for the next victim of disease. Some gravediggers also practiced ossuary work, removing bones from old graves and storing them in special charnel houses. This freed space in the cemetery for new burials. Working with the dead made them figures of fear and contempt. No one wanted to speak with them. Townsfolk believed they could bring death or curses. But without gravediggers, the city could not continue to live. They were guardians of the balance between life and death, an invisible, dirty, but necessary profession. Historical context and social perception. In the Middle Ages, sanitary conditions were catastrophic. City streets were narrow and paved with stone, but often covered in layers of manure, garbage, and human waste. The absence of sewage and modern water disposal systems led to widespread diseases and epidemics. Professions related to cleaning and waste processing were seen by society as disgusting and dangerous. These people occupied the lowest social ranks. However, their role was critically important for preserving the life and health of the other townsfolk. Historical documents and chronicles mention these masters of filth with disdain, but also with recognition of their necessity. Sometimes they were even granted certain privileges, such as tax exemptions or special living quarters. Psychological aspects and social taboos. Work involving filth, death, and waste left a heavy psychological mark. Many masters of filth faced loneliness, social isolation, and inner conflicts. Society creates taboos around such professions to distance itself from unpleasant realities of life. This helped maintain the illusion of cleanliness and order in everyday life. From an anthropological and sociological perspective, these taboos reflect deep human fears of death, dirt, and the unknown. Significance for modern society today. In the age of technology and civilization, many tasks once done by medieval masters of filth are performed by machines and specialized services. However, respect for sanitation workers and those who ensure cleanliness remains an important issue. Studying the history of these professions helps understand how society's attitudes toward dirt, death, and hygiene have changed, and teaches respect for those who perform the hardest but vital work. Unlicensed doctors and barber surgeons. In the Middle Ages, medicine was in its infancy. Official doctors were few, and only the wealthy and noble had access to them. The majority of the population relied on unlicensed healers, street physicians, folk healers, and barber surgeons. Barbers, originally hairdressers, gradually took on surgical roles: bloodletting, tooth extraction, treating wounds and fractures. They carried red and white striped poles, the symbols of bloodletting and medical practice. Barbers' tools were primitive: saws, scalpels, pincers. Sterility was unknown. Wounds were treated with herbs, mud compresses, or ointments made from fat and dirt. Bloodletters and primitive medicine. One of the most common procedures was bloodletting. It was believed many diseases were caused by excess blood or corruptions in the body. Bloodletting was performed using special tools, lancets and leeches. Blood spilled onto the ground, and patients often weakened from loss of blood and strength. Yet this was considered a cure. Medicines were based on combinations of herbs, minerals, and mystical rituals. Folk healers and herbalists sometimes knew real healing properties of plants, but their knowledge was mixed with superstitions and religious beliefs. Consequences and perception. Without formal medical education or modern knowledge, these doctors often caused harm. Infections, bleeding, and misdiagnoses frequently led to death. Still, city residents turned to barbers and bloodletters. There was no other choice. They were the only available specialists. Medicine in the Middle Ages is a story of struggle between knowledge and superstition, between pain and hope. Herbalists and apothecaries, keepers of medicines. In the Middle Ages, herbalists collected and prepared medicinal herbs and infusions. Their knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, often in secret, for fear of being accused of witchcraft. Apothecaries, often former monks or scholars, sold herbs, powders, ointments, and tinctures. Their shops were located near markets, and their customers included commoners and nobles. Preparations often included mixtures of herbs, minerals, fats, and even ashes. Treatments were slow, painful, and often ineffective, but belief in the power of herbs endured for centuries. Diseases and fears. Medieval cities often suffered from epidemics: plague, smallpox, tuberculosis. Without understanding the causes of the disease, people looked for those responsible for their troubles. The poor, gypsies, heretics, witches were often punished. Professions related to healing were surrounded by mysticism and fear. Nevertheless, These doctors, herbalists, and pharmacists performed a vital role. They were the only hope for many. Social status and attitudes of society. People working in medicine without diplomas and herbalists lived on the fringes of society. Their knowledge was valued, but they were feared and avoided. Barbers, surgeons, bloodletters, herbalists, all of them were simultaneously necessary and isolated. This reflected the general attitude towards dirty professions, respect for their usefulness, and disdain for their proximity to illness and death. Tools and treatment methods. Medieval barbers and healers' medical tools were primitive and often handmade by blacksmiths. Their kits included saws for amputations, pointed scalpels, pincers for tooth extraction, and lancets for bloodletting. Procedures were often performed without anesthesia. Patients endured pain with great courage, or were unconscious after blows. Amputations were a common method to combat infections and gangrene, but often led to death from blood loss or infection. Rituals and ceremonies. Medieval medicine was inseparable from religious beliefs. Many procedures were accompanied by prayers, blessings, and the use of holy water. Herbalists often used charms and spells, believing that illness was not only physical, but also a spiritual punishment. Monasteries collected medical books, mostly copies of ancient Greek and Arabic treatises, but most townsfolk received help from street healers and barbers. Lifestyle and risks of the profession. Work in medicine was dangerous and filthy. Constant contact with blood, pus, and contagious patients often led to illness and death of the healers themselves. Despite this, many chose this profession, considering it prestigious and important, especially barber surgeons, who could earn by treating the wounded and sick. Yet fear, contempt, and social isolation followed them everywhere. The role of medicine. During epidemics. During plague and other epidemics, medical workers stood on the front lines in the fight against disease. Barber surgeons and healers tried to treat people, often risking their own lives. Due to a lack of understanding of infections, many measures were ineffective or even harmful. For example, bloodletting during the plague could weaken patients and hasten death. Nevertheless, these specialists were the only hope for the suffering. They cared for the sick, performed dressings, and tried to ease suffering. The connection between masters of filth and medicine professions related to filth and death were closely linked with medicine. Gravediggers worked alongside doctors as they handled the burial of the sick and dead. Street cleaners removed garbage and waste, reducing the risk of disease spread. Their work helped maintain some level of sanitary order. Barber surgeons and bloodletters, despite their primitive methods, were an important part of the healthcare system of their time. Conclusion. Lessons from the past. The history of medicine and professions connected to filth and death teaches us to respect those who perform difficult and important work. Medieval masters of filth and stench are not just figures of the past, but reminders that society is built on the labor of many, including those whose work seems unpleasant or invisible. Without them, life and order in medieval cities could not have been preserved. Living conditions and hygiene in medieval cities. Living conditions in medieval cities were extremely harsh. Most houses lacked sewage systems, and street cleaning was infrequent and ineffective. Waste was often dumped directly onto the streets or into nearby rivers. People bathed rarely. Water was considered dangerous, and bathing was sometimes associated with religious rules and superstitions. Therefore, dirt and stench were constant companions of daily life. In these conditions, the role of the masters of filth was vital. They tried to maintain at least some cleanliness by removing garbage and waste. Perception of filthy professions in daily life society simultaneously feared and despised the masters of filth and stench. People avoided close relationships with them. Nevertheless, without their work, the city would have descended into chaos and disease. Therefore, these professions evoked mixed feelings, disgust and necessity. People became accustomed to their presence, but tried to keep their distance. This created a special social layer, almost outside society. Masters of filth as part of urban life. Despite social isolation, masters of filth played an important role in the urban order. They were necessary to ensure sanitation, bury the dead, and combat epidemics. City authorities sometimes officially hired such workers, understanding their value. However, wages were low, and working conditions were harsh. Their work remained invisible, but without it, normal life in the Middle Ages was impossible. Servants of death, gravediggers and body collectors. Gravediggers were among the most despised yet necessary professions of the Middle Ages. Their task, to dig graves for the deceased, was seen as disgusting and dangerous. Body collectors were responsible for finding and gathering corpses, especially during epidemics when the number of dead sharply increased. They risked their own health and lives, as contact with the sick and dead often led to infection. Anatomists, the first explorers of the human body. Anatomists were rare in the Middle Ages and often worked in secret due to religious prohibitions against dissecting bodies. Nevertheless, their work laid the foundations of medicine. Autopsies were conducted to study the structure of the human body, but society viewed anatomists with fear and suspicion. They were often accused of desecrating the dead, grave robbers, criminals, or desperate people. Grave robbers looted burials, taking valuable items or even bodies to sell to anatomists and doctors. Often, they were poor people trying to survive. Society and the church punished such acts harshly, considering them great sins and crimes. Yet, in difficult times, grave robbers played a role in supplying medical research and sometimes healing. Daily life and working conditions of gravediggers and body collectors. Gravediggers worked in all weather conditions, often at night or dawn, to avoid disturbing townsfolk and curious eyes. Their tools were simple: shovels, picks, ropes. Sometimes they had to manually retrieve bodies from narrow graves or water. Body collectors also transported corpses from infected areas and cemeteries. Their clothing was basic, often soaked with odors and disease. Social status and stigmatization. Servants of death lived on the margins of society. They were feared, viewed with suspicion, and often avoided. Despite this, they performed a vital function, maintaining order in cemeteries and preventing the spread of disease. They had no social respect and frequently faced discrimination and mockery. Dangers of the profession and psychological challenges. Working with the dead brought not only physical dangers, disease infection, injuries, but also heavy psychological burdens. Gravediggers and body collectors often suffered from fear of death, anxiety, and alienation. Many sought solace in religion or alcohol to cope with the heavy weight of their work. Anatomists, scientists on the edge of permission. Anatomists in the Middle Ages were pioneers in studying the human body. Despite church prohibitions and social prejudices, they performed dissections to understand the structure of organs and systems. Their work was often done in secret, sometimes at night, in small laboratories or specially designated places. Society viewed them with suspicion, sometimes considering them sacrilegious and violators of the sacred rest of the dead. Grave robbers, the dark side of medicine. Grave robbers engaged in illegal exhumation of graves to obtain bodies and valuable items. They were the link between the world of the dead and the growing medical demand for anatomical specimens. Sometimes grave robbers were desperate people trying to find work. Other times, they were professional criminals. Society hated them, viewing them as desecrators and criminals, but without them, doctors could not conduct their research. Dangers and consequences of grave robbing. The work of grave robbers was extremely risky. They were caught, imprisoned, or executed. Additionally, frequent contact with dead bodies and contaminated soil led to illnesses. Despite fear and punishment, demand for anatomical corpses forced grave robbers to continue their activities. The impact of servants of death on the development of medicine. Although the professions of gravediggers, body collectors, anatomists, and grave robbers evoked fear and disgust, they played a key role in the development of medicine. Anatomists, thanks to access to bodies, laid the foundations of anatomy and surgery, which became the basis for further discoveries. Without the work of grave robbers, medical science would have remained in its infancy. Society and moral dilemmas. Work with death and corpses raised complex moral questions. Society could not fully accept them, but simultaneously depended on them. These professions existed on the border between necessity and taboo, causing constant internal tension. Medieval cities could not exist without servants of death, despite fear and contempt. Lessons from the past for the present. The history of servants of death reminds us of the importance of respecting professions that are unpleasant but vital. Modern society should remember those who work with disease, death, and sanitation, ensuring our safety. Understanding and acceptance of such professions help build a more just and humane society. Rituals and traditions associated with death professions. Servants of death not only performed physical labor, but were also connected to numerous rituals and traditions. For example, gravediggers had to follow certain rites to avoid desecrating the peace of the deceased. In some regions, beliefs and prohibitions regulated the timing and manner of handling bodies. These rituals help society perceive death and the related professions as necessary and sacred. The impact of epidemics on the work of servants of death. During epidemics such as the plague, the workload of servants of death increased sharply. The number of deceased became enormous, requiring rapid clearing of cemeteries and streets. Gravediggers and body collectors worked under extremely harsh conditions, risking infection. This was a time of great fear and despair, when death professions became critically important for society's survival. Modern parallels and recognition. Modern sanitation, burial services, and pathology are direct descendants of medieval servants of death. Although technologies and conditions have changed, the essence of the work remains the same: caring for the body, health, and memory of the deceased. Modern society increasingly recognizes the importance of these professions and strives to respect those who face death daily. Alchemists, mystics, and chemists of the Middle Ages. Alchemists were among the most mysterious and controversial figures of the Middle Ages. They mixed substances, attempting to create the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. Their laboratories often emitted sharp and unpleasant odors of sulfur, mercury, and rotten materials. Alchemy was on the borderline between science and magic, and scientists in this field were often persecuted and suspected. Rat catchers, hunters of dangerous creatures. Rat catchers performed an important but unpleasant job, catching rats and other rodents that spread disease. These specialists worked in dirty and foul-smelling places: markets, warehouses, basements. The risk of infection and unpleasant conditions made their profession extremely difficult and poorly respected. Animal trainers, taming in danger. Animal trainers worked with taming animals, often dangerous and unpredictable. The work involved risks of injury and disease, and conditions were sometimes far from hygienic. Nevertheless, their activity was important for conducting experiments and entertainment. Scientists with dangerous work. The first researchers. Many medieval scientists conducted research involving dangerous substances and objects. They often faced risks of poisoning, explosions, and illnesses. Despite this, their research laid the foundation for the development of modern science and medicine. daily life and working conditions of alchemists. Alchemists worked in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms filled with the pungent odors of chemicals and burnt substances. Their experiments often led to explosions and fires, making their work even more dangerous. Despite this, alchemists continued their search for mysterious substances, dreaming of wealth and immortality. Public attitude towards rat catchers. Rat catchers were necessary but treated with suspicion and disdain. They were surrounded by a reputation for bringing disease and filth, even though they helped fight epidemics. Many rat catchers worked alone, living on the outskirts of towns and avoiding contact with others. Dangers and challenges faced by animal trainers. Animal trainers were often attacked by animals and suffered injuries. Working with dangerous animals required not only physical strength, but also psychological resilience. Many lost their health and lives, but their skills were essential for training and entertaining society. Scientific discoveries and the cost of danger. Scientists working with poisonous substances and hazardous experiments often sacrificed their health. Poisonings and accidents were common occurrences in medieval laboratories. Nevertheless, thanks to their courage and perseverance, science gradually advanced, bringing humanity closer to new knowledge. Religious perception and fear of alchemists. Alchemists often faced distrust and condemnation from the church. Their experiments and quest for the philosopher's stone were seen as dealings with evil forces or heresy. The Inquisition frequently persecuted alchemists, accusing them of witchcraft and blasphemy. Social status of rat catchers and their families. Rat catchers lived in poverty and isolation. Their family members often suffered from social exclusion and hardship. Nevertheless, rat catchers performed an important role in maintaining sanitation and public health. The image of animal trainers in culture and folklore. Animal trainers often became heroes of legends and folk tales. Their ability to control beasts inspired both fear and admiration. In some stories, they were portrayed as keepers of secrets and knowledge of nature, scientific communities, and knowledge exchange. Despite dangers, medieval scientists tried to unite and share knowledge. Some alchemists and researchers formed secret societies and guilds. These communities helped preserve and spread scientific discoveries despite persecution. Limitations and obstacles for scientists. Medieval scientists faced serious limitations: religious prohibitions, lack of resources, and absence of support. Many discoveries had to be hidden for fear of persecution. Scientists often worked alone or in small groups, which slowed progress. The influence of alchemy on the development of chemistry. Despite its mystical and occult aspects, alchemy made a significant contribution to the development of chemistry. Methods of distillation, extraction, and substance processing were discovered by alchemists and became the foundation for modern science. Alchemists laid the groundwork for experiments with substances and reactions. The role of scientists in combating epidemics. Scientists tried to understand the causes and ways to fight diseases. Although their methods were primitive, they laid the foundations of epidemiology and medicine. The role of scientists during these periods was critically important for saving lives. Conclusion and significance of foul-smelling science. Professions and activities associated with unpleasant odors and dangerous experiments were an important part of medieval society. Despite fear, rejection, and dangers, they contributed to the progress of science and medicine. The history of foul-smelling science is a story of courage, perseverance, and sacrifice for the sake of knowledge and human health. Influence on hygiene and sanitary practices. The work of servants of death, alchemists, and other specialists dealing with unpleasant odors and dangerous materials contributed to the development of early hygiene standards. Understanding the importance of cleaning and waste disposal became the foundation for forming sanitary regulations in cities. Their activities directly impacted public health and the prevention of epidemics, cultural heritage, and memory. Despite dislike and fear, professions associated with foul-smelling science left a significant mark on culture. Legends, tales, and medieval chronicles contain many mentions of alchemists, animal trainers, rat catchers, and others. This heritage helps better understand society's attitude towards science and dangerous professions of that time. Evolution of professions and their modern forms. Many medieval professions transformed and exist today in new forms. Modern chemists, sanitation workers, animal specialists, and pathologists continue the work of their predecessors. Studying the history of these professions helps appreciate their labor and understand the complexity of their work. Limitations and obstacles for scientists. Medieval scientists faced serious limitations, religious prohibitions, lack of resources, and absence of support. Many discoveries had to be hidden for fear of persecution. Scientists often worked alone or in small groups, which slowed progress. Conclusion, recognition, and respect. The history of foul-smelling science teaches respect for those who work with unpleasant, dangerous, and taboo aspects of life. Without these professions, modern society could not ensure safety, health, and scientific progress. Remembering them is a tribute to courage, diligence, and sacrifice for future generations. Daily difficulties and psychological burden. Working with unpleasant odors and dangerous materials placed a heavy psychological and physical burden on those in these professions. Many experienced isolation and misunderstanding from society. Despite this, they performed essential tasks without which city life would have been impossible. Risks in health. Constant contact with poisonous substances, decaying bodies, and dangerous animals led to chronic illnesses and reduced life expectancy. The lack of medicine and protective equipment worsened the situation. Nevertheless, these professionals continued their work, risking their health for the good of society. The role of foul-smelling professions in the development of science. The experience and knowledge gained by these professions became the foundation for further scientific discoveries. They provided experimental data and practical skills necessary for the advancement of medicine, chemistry, and biology. Their contribution often remains unnoticed, but invaluable. Representation in art and literature professions associated with unpleasant odors and dangerous experiments found reflection in art and literature. They served as symbols of humanity's struggle with natural and social challenges. This image continues to inspire artists and writers to this day. Manuscript scribes, guardians of knowledge. Manuscript scribes played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting knowledge during the Middle Ages. Monks dedicated to this work labored in monastery scriptoria, copying sacred and scholarly texts day after day. Their work was meticulous and repetitive, requiring intense focus and patience. Working conditions and challenges. Their work was done by the dim light of candles or oil lamps. Long hours of sitting and eye strain led to physical exhaustion and vision problems. They often had to deal with unstable or spoiled materials, parchment and ink. The importance of the scribe's labor. Thanks to their efforts, ancient knowledge, philosophical works, and religious texts were preserved. Scribes were the bridge between generations and the foundation for the continued development of culture and science. Their labor, though mostly invisible, was vital to society. Armor cleaners, guardians of combat, readiness. Armor and weapon cleaners were an essential part of the medieval military world. Their task was to keep battle equipment clean, functional, and polished. Rust, dirt, and damage could cost a knight his life in battle, so the cleaner bore great responsibility. Dirty and demanding work. The job required physical strength. Heavy plate armor, swords, axes, and shields had to be lifted, disassembled, and cleaned by hand. They used sand, oil, vinegar, and cloth. Simple but effective means of fighting corrosion and grime. Days were spent on repetitive and exhausting tasks on which a warrior's fate could depend. Invisible heroes of everyday life. The Middle Ages were built not only on the feats of knights, but also on the routine work of those who supported the world from within. Cleaners, scribes, rat catchers, grave diggers, they formed the backbone of the system, ensuring its survival. They held no noble titles, yet civilization rested on their labor. The view from above. Class contempt. Most of these professions were viewed by the upper classes with disdain or indifference. Manual labor, especially that involving filth, blood, or death, was considered lowly and shameful. However, without it, there would have been no castles, no libraries, no armies. Quiet innovators. Many of these dirty professions quietly pushed society forward. Alchemists searched for new substances. Rat catchers curbed the spread of disease. Armor cleaners extended the life of equipment. Their small innovations eventually became the foundation for new disciplines and crafts. Fight leaders, masters of the arena. In the Middle Ages, brutal spectacles were part of public festivals, fairs, and executions. Fight leaders, known as organizers of street fights, fist brawls, and animal combats, acted as directors, commanders, and overseers of the event. They managed the crowd, maintained the fairness of the battle, and prepared fighters for performance. Human spectacle. Fighters and victims. Often, the fighters were former prisoners, paupers, or slaves, forced to fight for survival. Sometimes they became local legends, but more often, they were expendable material for the show. Their bodies were covered in scars, and their lives were short and brutal. Blood as entertainment organizers of such fights did more than earn money. They stirred the darkest instincts of the crowd. Battles took place in filthy arenas, where blood mixed with dust and sweat. For some, a celebration; for others, their final day alive. Cesspit cleaners, night laborers of stench. One of the most reviled and foul-smelling professions was that of the cesspit cleaner, often called night soil men. They worked at night, manually emptying the contents of latrines, cesspits, and drainage wells. These workers saved cities from filth and disease, yet they were mocked, shunned, and constantly exposed to illness. Leech collectors, a bloody routine. Leeches were widely used in medieval medicine for bloodletting. Leech collectors would wade barefoot through swamps and shallow waters, allowing leeches to attach to their skin, then removed them into containers. The job was not only disgusting but dangerous, leading to infections, inflammation, and blood loss. Tooth pullers, tearing teeth without anesthesia. Medieval tooth masters, or tooth pullers, extracted teeth and treated oral diseases. Their tools were crude, hygiene non-existent, and the pain unbearable. Blood, pus, screams of patients, and the constant threat of infection made this one of the most brutal and filthy professions. Executioners, bearers of death. The executioner was a figure of fear and contempt. His job was to carry out executions by hanging, beheading, or more gruesome methods. Though serving the law, he was shunned even by those who hired him. Executioners lived on the outskirts, rarely married, and often passed their profession down through generations. Traveling barbers, razor, needle, and pain barbers, especially wandering ones, performed not only haircuts and shaves, but also medical procedures, bloodletting, lancing boils, removing arrows and teeth. They carried instruments soaked in blood and pus, serving peasants directly at markets and fairs. The work was dirty, dangerous, and demanded endurance, both physical and mental. Tar makers, masters of smoke and stench. Tar production required boiling resin, bark, and other organic waste in pits or cauldrons. Tar makers constantly smelled of smoke, tar, and decay. Their skin was covered with soot and sores, and their lungs clogged with soot. Their labor was vital for shipbuilding and construction, but their existence resembled life in hell. Sewer cleaners, invisible saviors of cities. Medieval cities were filled with waste that flowed through open sewers and drainage systems. Sewer cleaners worked in underground tunnels, facing terrible odors, toxic gases, and the risk of collapse. Their labor prevented epidemics, but was so dangerous and filthy that many feared even approaching them. Body collectors. The last servants. During epidemics and wars, body collectors played a key role. They gathered corpses from the streets and transported them to cemeteries or cremation sites. The work was physically exhausting and disgusting, and deadly dangerous due to the risk of infection. Healers and herbalists, helpers and outcasts. Healers and herbalists treated people using herbs and primitive recipes. Their knowledge was often considered witchcraft or heresy. They worked under constant fear of accusations and persecution. Nevertheless, without them, survival in the Middle Ages would have been much harder. Prostitutes, the shadowed women of the streets. Prostitution was widespread in medieval cities and villages. Women, often trapped in desperate situations, sold their bodies to survive. They worked in brothels or on the streets, constantly facing humiliation, danger, and disease. Social status and society's attitude both condemned and tolerated prostitutes. The church viewed them as sinners and often persecuted them, but authorities turned a blind eye, as prostitution was a source of income and a way to control the dirty social layers. Life in the shadows. The lives of prostitutes were short and harsh. They were vulnerable to violence, illness, and poverty. Their existence often remained invisible to most, but their role in medieval society was significant. Conclusion: filth, blood, and survival. Medieval disgusting professions are not just about dirt and stench. They tell the story of people forced to work in the hardest and most dangerous conditions for survival. They were forgotten by society, but their labor sustained the way of life of the era. The shadow of civilization. Without executioners, body collectors, sewer cleaners, healers, and many others, the medieval world simply could not exist. Their professions were necessary, despite the fear and disgust they provoked. Honor for the forgotten. Today, we can look at these professions not only with disgust, but also with respect. These are the people whose hard and dangerous work laid the foundation for the development of society. They are the invisible heroes whose efforts lie at the heart of human history. In the Middle Ages, common people held a deeply complex and contradictory attitude toward so-called disgusting or unclean professions. Society depended heavily on individuals who performed dirty, grueling, and essentially irreplaceable work. Yet, at the same time, they were met with disgust, contempt, and fear. This attitude was not just rooted in physical revulsion toward smells, filth, blood, or waste, but also in deeply ingrained religious, symbolic, and cultural ideas of purity and impurity, good and evil, high and low. Those engaged in filthy trades, whether executioners, butchers, tanners, night soil collectors, or gravediggers, were automatically seen as existing outside the bounds of moral respectability. Their labor was essential for the survival of society, yet their presence was viewed as shameful, a living reminder of death, decay, pain, and suffering, something to turn away from, ignore, or forget. Among the most despised were those who dealt directly with death: executioners and gravediggers. Executioners, though they carried out legal sentences and acted on behalf of authority, were seen with a kind of superstitious horror. They were feared as bearers of evil, tainted by their association with blood and killing. People avoided them in daily life, refused to greet them, wouldn't sit next to them at markets or churches, and resisted forming any social or familial connections. They lived outside city walls, often in isolation, and their children were forced to inherit the profession, as no other paths were open to them. Yet, behind that fear lay a certain measure of respect, an acknowledgement of their authority, their intimate knowledge of pain, the human body, and death. People often sought them out secretly for medical treatments, bone setting, or herbal remedies, though always through intermediaries. The executioner in the public imagination embodied both death and power, filth and mastery. Butchers, tanners, and leather workers were also seen as unclean. Their work involved slaughtering animals, handling blood and entrails, and processing hides with substances like urine, lime, and other foul-smelling chemicals. Their workshops reeked and were therefore pushed to the outskirts, near rivers, or beyond the main quarters of the city, away from churches and respectable neighborhoods. People viewed them with disdain, especially the clergy and urban elite. Despite the fact that everyone consumed meat, the act of killing animals was considered base, brutal, and spiritually polluting. Butchers often joined powerful trade guilds and could become wealthy, yet they were never fully respected. They weren't invited to major ceremonies, people were reluctant to marry into their families, and their daughters rarely found husbands outside the unclean trades. Still, the population relied on them, especially during feasts, religious holidays, or times of scarcity. This tension, dependence coupled with contempt, captures the essence of society's relationship with these professions. Even more marginalized were the so-called nightmen, those who removed human waste from latrines and cesspits. They worked at night so that others wouldn't have to see or smell them. People avoided even saying their names. Their bodies were seen as so polluted that in some towns they were banned from entering churches or receiving communion. They were mocked in jokes and popular tales and treated with open disdain. Yet they were the very ones who prevented cities from descending into filth, disease, and rot. During plagues, they were among the first to get sick and die. No one respected them, but without them, daily life was impossible. What united all of these professions was a deep contradiction. Society despised and shunned them, mocked and feared them. Yet, it could not live without them. They performed the labor that no one else wanted to do, and in return, were treated as morally and spiritually contaminated. In a world saturated by religious thinking, anything associated with the body, decay, and suffering was seen as sinful or degrading. Society projected its fear of death, pain, and physical impurity onto the people who worked in those realms. By casting them to the margins, socially, spatially, and spiritually, medieval communities sought to preserve a sense of moral purity for themselves. This contradiction between necessity and revulsion became one of the lasting cultural codes of European civilization. Even as cities grew and public health measures developed, the suspicion and disdain toward these professions lingered. They bore the invisible burden of doing society's most essential and most despised work. In the Middle Ages, professions considered disgusting or unclean were often passed down from father to son. This wasn't a matter of free choice, but rather a forced necessity, dictated by the rigid social structure and deep-rooted prejudices of the time. Society was strictly divided into the clean and the unclean. The latter included those whose work involved contact with bodily waste, dead bodies, blood, refuse, or killing. These were executioners, gravediggers, tanners, night soil collectors, butchers, people whose labor was vital to the functioning of towns and cities, but who reminded others of things they preferred not to confront: death, disease, suffering, filth, and the fragility of the human body. Though essential, these individuals became social outcasts. People avoided speaking to them, greeting them, or sitting near them in church. They were rarely granted community rights, and most importantly, their children had almost no way out of this inherited pollution. Boys born into the families of executioners or tanners began working from a young age. They learned how to handle tools, process leather, slaughter animals, dig graves, or, if their father was an executioner, how to use the whip and axe. Not only the craft was passed down, but also the social stain. If your father was an executioner, you were automatically seen as tainted. Even if the child wanted a different life, other paths were nearly impossible, because guilds, apprenticeships, and respectable trades were closed off to them. No one wanted to teach them, few wanted to befriend them, and marriage into a clean family was nearly impossible. The inheritance of the profession was informal, but rigid. It created a system of social enclosure, a small world where unclean jobs were passed within a narrow circle of families. Many children didn't even imagine another life. Their role was set from birth. If your father was an executioner, so would you be. Society punished any attempt to break free. Even if someone moved to another town, their origins would quickly be discovered, and the stigma would follow them. This was especially harsh for executioners. Their profession was not only revolting to most, but surrounded by a kind of mystical horror. Executioners were seen as both necessary and cursed. People believed their hands were stained with blood, and their souls prone to evil. Their children were often barred from schools, communion, and even burial in common cemeteries. But if a son followed his father's path, he inherited valuable knowledge: how to properly break bones during torture, how to treat dislocations, extract teeth, or use healing herbs. Many executioners were also healers or bone setters. This knowledge, too, was passed down from generation to generation. So the transfer of unclean professions from father to son was not just about money. It was enforced by the very structure of society. It was a closed circle that was nearly impossible to escape. People in these roles lived on the margins, and that's where they raised their children to take their place. And although they provided cities with cleanliness, leather, meat, and order, they and their descendants remained strangers in their own society for centuries. Attempts to escape unclean or disgusting professions in the Middle Ages were rare, but did exist. It was an extremely difficult, almost impossible path, as society at that time was rigidly structured and social mobility was practically non-existent. People's identity was defined not only by their profession, but also by their origin, place of residence, participation in church life, and even by their smell, both literally and figuratively. First and foremost, the family's reputation was the biggest obstacle. Even if the son of an executioner or tanner was educated, strong, and talented, his background worked against him. The family name quickly spread throughout the town, and people already knew who he was. Attempts to change professions were seen as a threat to the established order. If an unclean person became clean, it would undermine the entire social hierarchy. Therefore, even in guilds and brotherhoods where formal apprenticeships existed, such people were often refused without explanation. Nevertheless, some did try to break free, and sometimes they succeeded. One way was to move to another town, especially during times of plague, war, or famine, when old social structures weakened. People died or relocated, documents were lost, and one could start a new life under a different identity. For example, a former assistant tanner might claim to be a shoemaker, blacksmith, or merchant. But this was risky. If discovered, the person faced expulsion or even trial for forgery and defiling the craft. Another way was to enter the clergy. Sometimes children from unclean families tried to join monasteries, especially if they had connections or if the monastery was in decline and needed labor. In theory, the church preached forgiveness, and a butcher's son could become a monk. However, in practice, their past often followed them even inside the monastery walls. Other monks might avoid them, exclude them from the dining hall, or refuse to bury them with the brethren after death. Still, monastic life was sometimes the only chance to escape the stigma of the profession, especially if the person showed devotion and scholarship. Some tried to break free through marriage alliances. For example, if a daughter from a clean family married the son of an executioner, he might get a chance to change his fate, especially if he moved into his wife's family and adopted her trade. But such cases were extremely rare. and usually met with condemnation from both families. Sometimes such couples were forced to leave their hometown and start anew elsewhere under different names. It is worth noting those who transformed their unclean profession into a unique source of value. Some executioners were not only executioners, but also skilled bone setters, healers, and herbalists. Their skills in treating fractures, dislocations, and even skin diseases gradually earned hidden respect. People, especially the poor, sought them out because other doctors charged high fees. Although officially these doctors were shunned, in practice they could save lives. This did not make them respected, but it gradually gave them a dual status, despised externally, yet indispensable within the community. Thus, attempts to escape the social bottom existed through flight, deception, religion, marriage, or transforming the profession itself. However, all of these faced strong resistance from society. Medieval society zealously guarded the boundaries between clean and unclean, between the acceptable and the rejected. Those who tried to cross these lines risked not only their status, but their lives. Yet, it was precisely these attempts that, in later centuries, began to erode social rigidity and led to a more mobile society, where birth no longer completely determined one's fate. Families involved in disgusting professions in the Middle Ages faced numerous hardships that went far beyond simply performing dirty and difficult work. Their lives were filled with constant social pressure, economic limitations, and psychological challenges that left a mark on every generation and created a closed, isolated world. First and foremost, social isolation was an everyday reality for these families. They were avoided, feared, and despised. In villages and towns, there were unwritten rules prohibiting interaction with them. They were not invited to celebrations, excluded from certain public places, and people generally kept their distance. In churches, these people might have had to stand separately from other parishioners, or even be denied full participation in religious services. For children from such families, this meant learning from a young age to feel like outsiders, unwanted and inferior. Additionally, economic difficulties were an integral part of their lives. Although the work of disgusting professions was necessary for the city, it often did not bring a stable or decent income. Not only was the labor heavy and dangerous, but gaining clients or commissions depended on societal attitudes, which were often hostile toward these craftsmen. This affected their standard of living, health, and ability to provide decent upbringing and education for their children. The constant sense of contempt and distrust caused psychological stress and internal conflicts among family members. Parents understood that they were passing on a profession that would forever mark their children as outcasts. On one hand, there was pride in their craft and a desire to preserve traditions, pass on skills, and support the family. On the other hand, there was an awareness that this craft was a kind of social sentence. Many parents dreamed that their children could choose a different path, but reality rarely allowed it. Children in these families suffered especially hard. They not only inherited the dirty work, but also experienced social pressure and rejection from peers from an early age. Neighbors might mock them or avoid playing and socializing with them. Boys learned early that they faced hard and often dangerous work, while girls understood that their chances for a good marriage and decent life were reduced because of their family background. This atmosphere bred isolation and alienation, but sometimes also a desire to escape from that world. Even after death, these families struggled to receive respectful burial and remembrance. They were often buried separately, on the outskirts of cemeteries, without the honors given to others. This symbolized that they remained unclean and rejected even after death. In the end, the lives of these families were a struggle not only with external circumstances, dirt, hard labor, and poverty, but also with internal contradictions, fears, and hopes. They lived on the margins of society, simultaneously necessary and rejected, preserving crafts that no one wanted to see. Their fates illustrate the deep injustice and cruelty of the medieval world. where origin and profession often determined everything, from the ability to live with dignity to the right to human respect.